What if I told you that the most powerful military in the world once walked straight into one of the biggest disasters in its own history? What if the nation that is now seen as unbeatable entered a war with tanks, fighter jets, bombs, billions of dollars, and overwhelming military power, and still could not win? It sounds impossible, because we have always been shown the same image of America, that wherever it goes, it brings force, it brings dominance, and it bends the world to its will. But history contains a moment when that very superpower, despite all its strength, began to break. A war that was supposed to end in weeks dragged on for years. An enemy that was nowhere near as advanced, with no billion-dollar military, no superior air force, no endless supply of modern weapons, still managed to do something no one expected. It survived. And that survival slowly turned into America's nightmare. Battles hidden inside endless jungles, attacks from enemies that could not be seen, American soldiers dying day after day, and a war with no clear ending in sight. America believed it could crush everything with power, but the land of Vietnam showed it something entirely different. This was no longer just a war of bullets. It was a war of patience, a war of endurance, a war built around one terrifying question. Can the strongest military on Earth actually win every battle? And as body bags kept returning to the United States, another war quietly began. Inside America itself, people started asking questions. The media became louder, the streets filled with protests, and for the first time, the world watched a superpower begin to lose, not just on the battlefield, but in front of its own people. Think about it. Billions of dollars spent, hundreds of thousands of lives shattered, the most advanced weapons on Earth unleashed. But in the end, what happened? Did America win? Or did it walk into a swamp so deep that escaping it became its greatest humiliation? Because this is not just the story of a war. This is the story of the moment when the most powerful military in the world realized that not every enemy can be destroyed with bombs. Some wars are built to drain power itself. And Vietnam was that war for America. Today, we are opening one of the darkest chapters in U.S. military history, the chapter where America came to win, but the world watched it slowly fall apart. At the height of its global power, the United States believed there was one thing it could never allow to happen: the spread of communism. This was the era of the Cold War, a time when America and the Soviet Union were locked in a silent battle for global influence, and every country that turned communist was seen as a direct threat to American dominance. Washington feared something called the domino effect. The idea was simple, but terrifying. If one nation in Asia fell to communism, then another would follow, and then another, until America's enemies gained control over an entire region. And Vietnam suddenly became the center of that fear. At first, America did not enter Vietnam with a full-scale invasion. It entered slowly, quietly. Advisors were sent, money was sent, weapons were supplied. Support was given to South Vietnam in the hope that the communist North could be stopped before the conflict grew larger. But the conflict did grow larger, much larger. Because Vietnam was not just a local civil war anymore, it became a symbol of whether America could stop communism or whether its enemies would prove that American power had limits. And once that question entered Washington, backing down was no longer seen as an option. American leaders believed that if Vietnam was lost, America would look weak in front of the entire world. Its allies would doubt it. Its enemies would challenge it. Its image as the defender of global power would begin to crack. So instead of stepping away, America stepped deeper in. More troops arrived, more bombs were dropped, more money was poured into a land that most Americans did not even understand. By the mid-1960s, what had started as limited involvement was turning into a full military commitment. Young American soldiers were now being shipped across the ocean into a country they had never seen, to fight an enemy they barely understood, in a war that had no clear front line. And this is where the first great mistake was made. America believed this would be another demonstration of superior military strength, a fast campaign, a clear victory, a show of force. But Vietnam was not built for conventional victory. This was not open desert. This was not a battlefield where tanks could simply roll through and dominate. Vietnam was dense jungle, hidden tunnels, invisible movement, a place where the enemy could disappear into the land itself. American commanders had entered expecting a war they knew how to fight. Instead, they had stepped into a war designed to drain them slowly, and they did not realize it yet. But the deeper America moved into Vietnam, the harder it would become to ever get out. The moment American boots touched the soil of Vietnam, the illusion of an easy victory began to disappear. This was not the kind of war America had trained for. There were no clear enemy lines, no obvious targets, no cities to capture that would suddenly end the conflict. Instead, there was only jungle. Miles and miles of suffocating jungle, a green maze so thick that visibility disappeared within a few feet, where every tree, every shadow, and every patch of ground could be hiding death. The enemy was almost invisible. The North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong did not fight like a normal army. They did not stand in open fields waiting to be attacked. They hid. They watched. They waited. And when American soldiers felt safe, they struck. Gunfire from nowhere, explosions under the ground, traps hidden beneath leaves, tunnels running like veins under entire villages. This was psychological warfare as much as physical warfare, because the American soldier was not just fighting an enemy, he was fighting fear itself. Every step forward felt like a gamble. Every quiet moment felt suspicious. Every village looked peaceful, until it wasn't. The jungle turned into a living nightmare. Soldiers could not trust the land. They could not trust the silence. They could not even trust the civilians around them, because the enemy blended in, disappeared, then returned again after every assault. And this slowly began to destroy morale. America had entered Vietnam with machines, helicopters, bombs, and superior firepower. But none of that mattered when the enemy refused to fight on America's terms. This was not a war of domination. It was a war of exhaustion. The United States would clear an area by day and lose control of it by night. They would bomb a position, only to find the enemy had vanished into tunnels. They would count bodies. Yet the war somehow never moved closer to ending. This created something even more dangerous than battlefield casualties: confusion. Because American commanders kept asking the same question. How do you defeat an enemy you cannot see? How do you win territory that never stays won? How do you crush a force that seems willing to lose everything and still continue fighting? There were no easy answers. So America responded the only way it knew how, with more power, more bombs, more troops, more destruction. Entire sections of jungle were burned, villages were raided, massive bombing campaigns were launched in the hope that superior force would break the enemy's will. But instead of ending the war, it only made Vietnam burn harder. And as the fire spread through the jungle, America began to realize something terrifying. This war was not getting smaller. It was swallowing them whole. By 1968, American officials were still telling the public that progress was being made. They claimed the enemy was weakening. They claimed victory was getting closer. They claimed the war was under control. But then, Vietnam exploded. In one coordinated moment that shocked the entire world, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched what would become known as the Tet Offensive. More than 100 cities, towns, and military targets were attacked almost simultaneously. Gunfire erupted where America thought the enemy had already been defeated. Explosions shook supposedly secure zones. Even the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, one of the most protected locations in the country, came under attack. And in that instant, the American narrative shattered. Because if the enemy was truly losing, how were they capable of striking this hard? How were they everywhere at once? How had the most powerful military in the world failed to see this coming? The shock was not just military, it was psychological. American soldiers on the ground were overwhelmed. Commanders were stunned. Washington was shaken. But perhaps most importantly, the American public was horrified. Millions watched the footage. Cities in flames, street executions, chaos in places that had been described as secure. The message was unmistakable. This war was nowhere near finished. And suddenly, all the promises of nearing victory sounded hollow. The government had spent years trying to convince the nation that control was possible. Tet Offensive destroyed that illusion in days. Trust collapsed even further. Journalists began reporting with a much darker tone. Political leaders started distancing themselves. Critics grew louder than ever. And ordinary Americans began to accept a possibility they had resisted for years. America might actually lose. That thought was devastating, because this was not just about Vietnam anymore. This was about national identity. The United States had built its modern image on the idea of superiority, competence, and unstoppable military force. Now that image was bleeding on television. Inside Vietnam, soldiers felt the pressure immediately. Every mission became heavier. Every patrol carried more anxiety. Because now they were not just fighting the enemy. They were fighting the sinking realization that all this suffering might lead nowhere. And once a military begins to doubt the meaning of its own mission, its strength starts to fracture. Tet Offensive did not destroy America in a single battle, but it destroyed something far more valuable: confidence. From this point forward, Vietnam was no longer a war America expected to win. It was a war America was desperately trying to survive. And that changed the entire course of history. After the Tet Offensive, one truth became impossible to hide. America was stuck. The war had consumed too much money, too many soldiers, and too much political credibility to simply continue as if nothing had happened. But ending it was not simple either, because withdrawing from Vietnam would mean admitting something unthinkable, that the most powerful nation on earth had failed. And for Washington, failure was not just military, it was symbolic. If America left Vietnam without victory, its enemies would celebrate it, its allies would question it, and the image of American invincibility would suffer a wound the whole world could see. So the government searched desperately for a middle path, not full victory, not full surrender, just a way out that did not look like humiliation. More negotiations were discussed, new military plans were introduced, different strategies were tested, presidents changed, promises changed. But the battlefield did not change enough. American troops were still dying, the enemy was still fighting, and the war still had no clean ending. Inside the United States, patience had run out. The anti-war movement became louder than ever. Massive demonstrations filled the streets. Students clashed with police. Families demanded answers. Veterans spoke publicly about the horrors they had witnessed. This was no longer just criticism. It was national exhaustion. People were tired of hearing that progress was around the corner. They were tired of funerals, tired of lies, tired of sacrificing lives for a mission that looked increasingly pointless. And this growing pressure made one thing clear. America did not need a better battle plan anymore. America needed an exit. Troop numbers slowly began to reduce. Responsibility was pushed more heavily onto South Vietnamese forces. Negotiations in Paris dragged on. But even as officials talked about peace, everyone could feel the same uncomfortable reality. This was not the language of victory. This was the language of escape. The superpower that had once entered Vietnam promising to stop communism at all costs was now trying to leave with whatever dignity it could still save. And dignity was becoming harder to find, because every withdrawal announcement sounded like retreat. Every peace discussion sounded like concession. Every reduction of troops looked like another silent admission that the war had gone terribly wrong. America was not marching out of Vietnam as a conqueror. It was backing away from a nightmare it no longer knew how to control. And the entire world was watching, waiting to see whether the strongest military machine on Earth would leave this war with honor or with humiliation written across its history forever. By the early 1970s, the truth was no longer hidden behind speeches. America was leaving. Not because it had achieved victory, not because the mission was complete, but because it could no longer carry the weight of a war that had drained its strength, divided its people, and shattered its confidence. Years of bombing had not broken Vietnam. Years of troop deployments had not ended resistance. Years of promises had not created success. The war had taken everything America could throw at it, and still refused to end on America's terms. One by one, American combat forces pulled back. Peace agreements were signed. Officials tried to present it as a responsible transition, but everyone understood what it really was: a slow withdrawal from failure. Then came the moment that sealed the humiliation forever. In 1975, as North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon, panic spread across the city. South Vietnam, the government America had spent years protecting, was collapsing. Its defenses were crumbling. Its future was vanishing in real time. And America could do almost nothing to stop it. What followed became one of the most haunting images in military history. Helicopters lifting desperate people from rooftops. Crowds pushing toward evacuation points. Officials, civilians, and allies all scrambling to escape before the city fell. The world watched in disbelief. This was not the image of a superpower ending a successful mission. This was the image of a superpower fleeing the wreckage of its own failed war. Saigon fell, and with it, the illusion of American invincibility fell too. For nearly 2 decades, the United States had poured blood, money, weapons, and political will into Vietnam. More than 58,000 American soldiers were dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions of Vietnamese lives shattered, billions upon billions of dollars gone. And in the end, America left without victory. That is what made Vietnam different from every confident speech that came before it. This was not just a costly war. This was a public lesson that even the strongest military on Earth could be trapped, exhausted, and forced to retreat. Vietnam changed America forever. Its leaders became more cautious. Its people became more skeptical. Its military became more aware that superior firepower does not automatically create success. Because some wars are not won by who has the bigger bombs. Some wars are won by who can endure longer. And in Vietnam, America discovered that power has limits. This became the greatest military humiliation in modern U.S. history. A war entered with unmatched confidence and exited with helicopters, chaos, and silence. The strongest military in the world had gone in to prove that it could not be challenged. Instead, it proved that even giants can bleed. Vietnam was more than just a war. It was the moment the world saw that even the strongest military machine could be dragged into a fight it could not control. It was the moment America learned that power alone does not guarantee victory. And it was the moment history proved that some defeats leave scars far deeper than any battlefield. So now I want to ask you, do you think Vietnam was truly America's biggest military failure? Or do you believe there was an even greater mistake hidden somewhere else in U.S. history? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy deep military documentaries like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the next story is even darker.